So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the digital technology is changing our lives. I have a lot to say. I think I have to wrap this up by about 12:30, right? So let's get started. And before I talk a little bit about some of the insight and some of the themes we see, let me take about 2 minutes and share a little bit of the work I do so that you can understand where our data and our analysis comes from. I'm an old television guy. I've spent most of my life in and around television, the most powerful medium ever invented. And in the work I did in television, I was always taught that we blew it where television was concerned. We lost a great opportunity. And what I mean by that is television, if you think about it, is the only mass medium we knew ahead of time was going to be a mass medium. There was no question in the 1940s and 50s that radio listeners were going to embrace radio with pictures. So since we knew ahead of time that television was going to be a phenomenon, what I was always taught that we should have done but didn't do is we should have tracked people before they had television and then gone back to them year after year as they acquired and used it to see how it changed their lives. And if we had done that, we would have learned some pretty compelling things, starting with where did the time for television come from? When Americans, Japanese, and other Asians, Europeans were watching 3 hours of television a day, and we were asked where did that time come from? What were we doing less of? We didn't know. We just grabbed that time out of the air. We could have learned if the time for television came from talking as a family, reading books or newspapers, sleep, or from some other place. And I became convinced in the late 90s that the impact of digital technology, first the web and now mobile, was going to be far more powerful than television. So believing that we lost a great opportunity with television and that the impact of digital was going to be even more powerful than television, 10 years ago, we launched this massive project, this tracking of digital that we thought should have been conducted of television in the 40s. And very briefly, we started in the US with a representative sample of the American population. We've gone back to the same people 10 years in a row. We've watched as non-users moved to dial-up. As dial-up users migrated to broadband, we saw almost immediately broadband changed everything, not for the reason most people think, not because of the speed, but it's the always-on, the direct connection that changes the whole relationship to the web, has led it to become our most important source of information, surpassing all other media, has led us to wanting the internet not just on our desks at home and the office, but in our cars and pockets and purses. We watch as about 2% drop off the web each year, and we want to know who are these people who leave and why, and more importantly, do they return? And if so, when and what brings them back? And then 10 years in, we track the never users. Who are the people who have never gone online and why? And increasingly a question we're starting to ask, should we care? Should we be twisting their arms, persuading them, cajoling them to go online? Or should we let those who choose not to participate to live their lives peaceably and happily off of the web? We started in the US. We're now in about 30 countries around the world. We're in all the places you would expect us to be in Europe and Asia and Latin America, increasingly in Africa. We have some very interesting and unusual partners. We have a great partner in Iran, and I'm happy to report one of our oldest partners for 9 years we have right here in Japan. So that's a little bit of what I do. Let me now share some of the insights, some of the things that I think are relevant that we've learned over the last 10 years. And start with traditional media and what's changing with traditional media. I used to teach mass communication. For any of you who've spent time in Los Angeles, I used to teach at UCLA. And when I used to teach, I argued that no mass medium goes away or disappears. They adapt, they change. If ever a medium were going to go away, it would have been radio after the beginning of television, when television sucked all the content out of radio, took all the stars out of radio. Radio didn't roll over and die. It adapted. It changed. It formed relationships with the music industry. And today, radio is a vibrant and important medium, but it's a smaller business than it used to be. As we look at all of our mass media, we think they will all survive, but most of them, with one big exception, will survive as smaller players in a digital era. Now, this has been going on already even before the internet. If you look at theatrical film, going to the movies in the theater, in North America in 1946, we sold 4.3 billion movie tickets. Last year, the population more than doubled since 1946. In order to keep pace, we would have had to sell about 9 billion movie tickets. Instead, we sold 1.4 billion. Put another way, 1946, 90 million people a week went to the movies. Last year, population more than doubled, 22 million people a week went to the movies. Theatrical film has become a tiny business. It's not a coincidence that it reached its peak in 1946 on the eve of the introduction of television, yet it remains a high-profile business, a highly profitable business. It drives the home video business, but it's learned how to survive as a smaller business. The music industry. The music industry has a business model that is nothing short of extortion. The business model of the music industry says you like 2 songs, you have to go out and spend $16 on a CD. Today, interest in music has never been greater. People are listening to more music in more places than they ever have before. Love of music is higher than it has ever been before. But people aren't going to the music store and spending $16 on a CD. In most cities, you can't even find a music store. In America, our 2 flagship music stores, Tower Records on Sunset Strip, closed 2 years ago. Virgin Megastore in Times Square, along with every other Virgin Megastore in America, closed May of last year. The Tower Records Piccadilly Circus, long gone. People aren't going to the music store. They're going online and either stealing the 2 songs or going to legal downloading services, the most famous example being iTunes, and spending $2. The depressing future of the music business, not music. Music has an incredible future. But the depressing future of the music business says if they get it right, if they figure out how to get you and your children to go online and buy music rather than steal it, and that's a big if they do, then what used to produce $16 gross for them will now produce $2, and that's if they succeed at doing it, and that's somewhat questionable. If you want to see what's happened to music sales over the last generation or so, during the high point of the music industry in the English-speaking world, in the 80s and 90s, as LPs morphed into CDs, to be the #1 selling album in the English-speaking world, you had to sell at least 15 million copies a year. Sometimes an album would come along and sell as many as 30 million copies. Michael Jackson's Thriller, even before his death and increase in sales last year. Eagles' Greatest Hits, Alanis Morissette's Jagged Little Pill, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, which never seems to have ever stopped selling. But you had to sell at least 15 million copies to be #1. 2005, the #1 selling album of the year, Mariah Carey's The Emancipation of Mimi, 4.9 million copies. 2006, Disney's High School Musical, shows you who's buying music, 3.9 million copies. 2007, a guy I'd never even heard of until I saw he sold the #1 album that year, Josh Groban's Christmas album, 3.7 million copies. 2008, Lil Wayne, not Little Wayne, but Lil Wayne, 2.8 million copies. Just from 2005 to 2008, it dropped from 4.9 to 2.8. And last year, it actually went up a little bit. That wasn't bucking the trend. Overall, CD sales were still down 20%, but the #1 album went from 2.8 to 3.1, Taylor Swift. Music is becoming a fringe business, learning how to make money in other ways than selling 12 songs for $16. making money off of touring. Now companies like Live Nation have signed deals with Madonna where they get a percentage of her touring revenue. And the more easily music is available, or the more freely, the more it increases interest in touring. One of the reasons why Coldplay released their first single on their album last year for free on the internet. They get a cut of merchandising, they get a cut of endorsements and promotions and things like that. Incidentally, this is not scientific, it's just anecdotal. I went through my CD collection, and I counted about 400 CDs. And I looked through each one briefly, and I said, if I could have bought those song by song, how many would I have bought more than 2 songs? And there were some of them. There was Pink Floyd's The Wall, where I probably would have bought every song. There were about 18, or 4%. So that as I looked at my 400 CDs, I was looking at music I treasured, but I also was looking at thousands of dollars I was compelled to spend that I wouldn't have spent if I had a choice. Print, starting with newspapers. We know that 30 years ago, teenagers didn't read newspapers, but started to when they got into their 20s and 30s. Today, teenagers don't read newspapers, and the evidence is clear, they never will. Now, a lot of people look at that and say, well, they just don't care about news. All they care about is what's happening on Twitter or Facebook. Nothing could be further from the truth. Teens all over the world more interested in news today than any teenage generation in the last 70 years. They figured out that what happens halfway around the world can change their lives. They're just not going to the newspaper, they're going online to get their information. In every country in the world we are in, including Japan, when internet penetration gets to 30%, offline printed newspaper sales begin to decline. So that India, where internet penetration's at about 12 to 14%, printed newspaper sales skyrocketing. But everywhere it gets to 30% or higher, it begins to decline. The sad truth for newspapers is every time one of their readers dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. I went 10 years ago to the American Society of Newspaper Editors conference. Incidentally, they changed their name last year to the American Society of News Editors. I went to the ASNE conference in the year 2000 and shared with them what I just said. I looked at them and I said, every time one of your readers dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. And I said, you have 25 to 30 years left. They called me dangerous. They called me an alarmist. They called me everything except what it turns out I actually was, which was not correct. I was an optimist. Because if I was right 10 years ago that they had 25 to 30 years left, then today they would have 15 to 20, if only. In America, newspapers are down, I think, to their last 5 years, as papers, as printed newspapers off of a press. In the rest of the world, even in some of the strongest newspaper reading societies, Japan, Sweden, Norway, it's probably down to 10 to 12 years. In the last 12 months, the San Francisco Chronicle has lost 25% of its circulation. My hometown newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, 4 years ago had a circulation of over 1 million. It's down under 700,000. Never have we seen it move this fast. Magazines are more of a mixed story. Some magazines will survive forever. Magazines that have news, whether it's Time or Newsweek internationally, whether it's Maclean's in Canada, Der Spiegel in Germany, they'll be gone in 3 years or so. Last week, the Washington Post put Newsweek up for sale, acknowledging they can't find a way to make money from it, seeing if somebody else could. The internet does news quicker, faster, better, has moving pictures and sound, but some magazines will survive forever. Women's magazines. Magazines that women read as much for the advertising as the content, the pull and sniff perfume ads, the thick glossy paper, all of those things, they will survive forever because for a woman, the experience of reading Vogue online is not very satisfying. So all of these media survive, but most of them survive as smaller players and smaller businesses. The exception is television. Now, we really should craft a better term than television, which to most of us means the set in the home on a schedule. And all television means for now and the future on is audio and video. And YouTube is as much television as the BBC or CBS in America or NHK here in Japan. But we're going to use the word television to mean any audio and video. Our work shows fairly conclusively that people will watch television on a small screen in their pocket or purse. Not just 2 or 3 minute clip packages or news information, but 30 and 60-minute shows and films. Sometimes they'll watch those 60-minute shows straight through if they're stuck at the airport. Sometimes they'll watch them in 5, 8, or 10 parts if they don't have time. Keep in mind that at the same time as we're putting these little screens in our pockets and purses, we're putting bigger and better screens in our homes than we've ever had before. The gap between the home and the theater has never been so narrow. The time gap has never been so short. And sometimes we will save our preferred content for that big, beautiful HD screen. I did a talk about a year ago, and there was a Canadian in the audience who raised his hand and said, "I'm a Canadian and I'm a big hockey fan," which is pretty redundant if you think about it. And he said, "Why would I ever watch a hockey game on a mobile phone?" And the answer is you won't. If you love hockey, you'll seek out the biggest and best screen you can find unless you can't get to the big screen, and it's more important to see it sooner rather than later. Nobody is going to watch Avatar for the first time on a mobile phone. They may watch it for the second or third time on a mobile phone. And as they do, something very simple but extraordinarily important happens. It's going to change our lives. Television is going to escape from the home. Television never really existed outside the home until now. The exception's the hospital. If you're sick, that's your home. The bar, for some people, that's their home. But television really couldn't grow because it already dominated our at-home awake time. Most of us turn the television set on the moment we enter the home, leave it on till we go to sleep. Some of us go to sleep with it on, and some of us leave it on when we're not at home so that people think we are at home. But now television's going to escape from the home, and we're going to be watching it at the airport, waiting for a plane, on the airplane itself, in the back seat of our cars. It's going to be everywhere. And as it does, television's going to become our constant companion. Who's our constant companion now? If we're stuck at the airport with nothing to do, most of us don't pull out a magazine or a newspaper. We pull out our mobile phones and start calling people. And it's only after someone answers do we figure out whether we really have anything we want to say to them. My mother figured this out a long time ago. Whenever I call my mother, she'll say, "What, you're stuck somewhere? You have nothing better to do than to call me?" And she's right. But she also figured out, hey, it means we get to talk more often. 1975, around the world, in the developed world, we spent 16 hours a week in front of a screen. Last year, it was up to 34 hours. The difference, of course, was 75. It was that one screen in the home on a schedule. Last year, it was 3 screens. And we think those 34 hours will be over 50 hours in the next couple of years. With teenagers, we practically don't see a moment of their lives, except when they're asleep and in school, that they're not in front of a screen. And I'm not so sure that's true when they're in school, and some of them actually put the mobile phone under their pillow or next to their bed as they're sleeping. So television, unlike the other media, we think will grow exponentially. A little bit of what we're seeing with social networking, which we think is the real deal. The first thing we've seen that has caused people to log onto the web more often than to check their email. Now, we think which community a teenager is in is a fad or a trend. 5 years ago, Rupert Murdoch bought MySpace, talking about how it would allow him and News Corporation to reach teenagers in a way no other medium could. And just after he bought it, we had released our 5th year's report, and I was doing an interview, and the reporters were asking all about the findings in our report. And then the last question, almost a throwaway question, was, what do you think about Murdoch buying MySpace? And I said, it's a great investment. That part of the quote got forever lost. I said, it's a great investment, but he'll never be able to hang on to the teenage users of MySpace. News Corp, who bought it because of the teenagers, got really angry at that quote and fought back, not by saying we were wrong, but by saying, look how much money we've made. And they were absolutely right. They spent $580 million for MySpace. Almost as soon as they bought it, they signed a $900 million ad share deal with Google, practically doubling their investment. And $580 million looked like a great investment when the following year NBC Universal bought iVillage, a far inferior property, for $626 million, or the $850 million that AOL spent 2 years ago on Bebo, which they've just announced they're going to close, or the $1.6 billion that Google has spent on YouTube. So it was a great investment, and they have made money on it. But it turns out we were right. They weren't able to hang on to their teenage users. What we had seen by tracking Friendster, and actually GeoCities before Friendster, and then the rise and fall of Friendster, although I should be very careful about talking about the fall of Friendster. I was at a conference in Asia about a year ago, and after talking about the demise of Friendster, when I finished, 2 very nice people came up to me and handed me their Friendster business cards and said, we're huge in the Philippines. And I looked into it. Indeed, they are. Not much else, not many other places, but in the Philippines, they're still a way of life. But what we had seen was that to teenagers, an online community, and we got a lot of attention for this analogy, but an online community is like a nightclub. And when the nightclub becomes too popular, or the uncool kids start showing up at the nightclub, you're out of there. Because the cost of going from one nightclub to another, or one community to another, is almost nil. What's the worst thing that could happen to you as a teenager in a nightclub? Not literally the worst thing. That would be a bomber coming in and setting off an explosive. But to a teenager, the worst thing that could happen to you in a nightclub is running into your mother. Well, now on Facebook, your mother wants to friend you. And how long will you stay in a place where your mother's hanging around with your friends? So we think, just as MySpace morphed into Facebook, we think Facebook, which right now, if it were a country, would be the 3rd biggest country on the face of the earth, we think will be a victim of its own success as well. Not that people will abandon it. We think it'll be too valuable to give it up completely, but we think people will move to other communities. I don't think we're ever going to see a monolithic one like that again. I think it's going to fragment and become far less important, in the same way that most MySpace users who were on most Facebook users who were on MySpace still maintain their membership, but rarely go there. But more importantly, even though which community a teen is in will change, keep in mind that the heaviest users of social networking groups are people in their 60s and 70s. And they're the ones who derive the most value from them. They're just in different, they're in Facebook as well, but they're in different communities, learning how to be a better chess player, dealing with the physical or emotional toll of cancer, talking about politics or religion or hobbies or anything that's on their mind. But we think Time magazine, as I said, got it wrong 3 years ago when it made its Person of the Year. If you looked at its Person of the Year issue, there was a piece of metallic covering on the front, and you looked in and you saw your picture, a reflection of yourself. And Time was saying, in this user-generated world, the Person of the Year was you. They were wrong. It wasn't you. It was us, this new way of becoming a community. The last thing I want to do, and it's one of my favorite things to do, and it covers an awful lot of territory, is talk a little bit about teenagers around the world and some of the things we're seeing with teenage behavior. And by teenagers here, we'll break this to 12 to 24. In the work I do, I spend a lot of time with teenagers. I have tremendous respect for teenagers. I love teenagers in every way that's appropriate. So let me share a little bit of what we're finding. As I already mentioned, we think teenagers will never read a newspaper, but will never read a newspaper offline with print, but they will read some magazines. Incidentally, teenagers are turning against newspapers not just because they're inefficient compared to the web, they also view them as environmentally unfriendly. If you look at the New York Times, because of scale, at its peak 2 years ago, the New York Times was printing 200 million pieces of paper a day, except on Sunday when it printed 2 billion pieces of paper, and then hired thousands of trucks using gasoline, spewing carbon into the air to deliver those papers. Teenagers are turning to their parents saying, how can you read the newspaper? Don't you care about the future of the earth? And many of us are getting, and some of us are sending emails at the bottom of which there's a line that says, please be kind to the earth and don't print this out. Now, a lot of that's unfair. Newspapers are printed on recycled paper, and the perception is that digital is completely green. Digital has all kinds of problems, starting with recycling of computers and where we send them and the poisons they put into water supplies. But when you're sitting at a computer doing a Google search, what could feel more green than that compared to the thousands of pieces of papers you see all around you? We think teenagers, we already know this, is pretty easy to prove, will never own a landline phone. They haven't even made a distinction between landline and mobile phones. And something we discovered by accident, we're not the only ones to discover this, teenagers, especially boys, aren't wearing watches. They're telling time, of course, from their mobile phones. And now the entire jewelry industry, not to mention the economy of Switzerland, is waiting to the answer to the question, will they start wearing watches when they get older? Well, we've been tracking people for 10 years. So we have people who were 15 when we started and who are 25 now, and they're still not wearing watches. Now, I've gotten into discussions and debates with teenagers that I'm right, but it doesn't matter. And what I mean by that is I will explain to them, as a guy over 24, I know that will shock you, that if I want to know the time, it's a lot easier to do that than to fumble around, find my phone, turn it on, and look. And I'm right, but it doesn't matter that I'm right. They're just not interested. There will always be some watches that will sell $5,000, and actually that's probably the bottom price, and higher for Rolexes. Nobody, and other fine watches, nobody buys those because they tell time better. If all you want is accurate time, you can buy a $20 watch that will give you perfect time. Those send messages beyond that. We think teenagers barely understand the concept of watching television on somebody else's schedule. When you talk to a teenager about the days you used to watch television when a broadcast network told you you had to watch television, or more shocking, that you had a favorite show and you wouldn't leave the house until after it aired or had to be home before it started, you're going to sound to them the way our great-great-grandparents would have sounded to us talking about horses and buggies. Teenagers, something I find disturbing, and yet fortunately they outgrow this, they trust unknown peers more than experts. They argue that the unknown peers they meet on Facebook and MySpace and Twitter and other social networking sites are just like them. And being just like them, they have no self-interest and they can share honestly. To the degree that an unknown peer really is a peer, they may be right. But sadly, we know that unknown peers can also be predators, scammers, or even worse. Finally, after tracking for 10 years, we're seeing among teenagers concerns about privacy that rival those of adults over the last 10 years. Something seems to be changing. Beginning in 2005, we saw for the first time some willingness to pay for digital content. Up until then, people thought that everything digital on the web ought to be free the way the good Lord intended it to be. They understood that if you went online to buy a book, well, of course you paid for that. That was physical goods. But that digital goods somehow just miraculously appear and are there for the taking, that's begun to change a little bit. Something we also found disturbing, and fortunately they outgrow, teenagers have little interest in the source of information. Most of their information comes aggregated at Yahoo, Google, or MSN that do have the sources there, but most teens aren't looking at the source. They view information as a commodity. As they get older and they make more important decisions in their lives about careers, healthcare, retirement, investments, then the source becomes very important to them, and that changes. Community, as I said a few moments ago, is at the center of everything. The first thing that's caused people to log on more than to check their email. That's not going to change. Community is becoming the center, social networking of politics, of marketing, of virtually everything. While where we go is a fad, its importance isn't. Teenagers think they're not affected by advertising or brand. They think they're too shrewd, too sophisticated, too knowledgeable to ever be affected by an ad. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. If you want to see how much a teen you know is affected by brand, try giving him or her an MP3 player that is not an iPod, and then duck quickly as they throw it back at you. Of course they're affected by brand. We just know we are. They have yet to figure that out. Everything will move to mobile. Sadly, everybody in the world gets this, especially Japan and South Korea and the Nordic countries. Everybody gets this except America. We in America are still a third world country where mobile is concerned, where the rest of the world's using their mobile phones to buy Cokes out of machines. In Israel, you can pay for your parking meter when you're 6 blocks away at a restaurant, although I never understood that because I always thought the purpose of parking meters was to be able to give you a ticket, not to help you to put more money into the meter. And here in Tokyo, you can walk out of an office building at lunchtime and your mobile phone will show you all the restaurants in a 2-block radius that have tables available. Or in London, your mobile phone will show you all the public restrooms in the immediate vicinity. A very handy feature. We in America can barely get our mobile phones to work above ground for voice communication. I wish that were just a cheap line. Unfortunately, it is true. Nonetheless, as the rest of the world goes on the internet, and we saw in Michael's great presentation yesterday, it's about 1 billion people. As that billion climbs, it's not going to be in most instances through PCs sitting on the desk. Our work shows only about 4 to 6% of people who own PCs actually need the power of a PC. Those would be computer-assisted designers, heavy-duty writers, number crunchers. Most people are using a PC to surf the web or to check their internet, their email, and we think only, as I said, 4 to 6% need it. As the rest of the world goes online, it's not going to be with PCs on the desk. It's going to be through mobile phones, which are already in the hands of close to 5 billion people on the face of the earth, compared to the 1 billion who are on the internet. And most of those 5 billion phones eventually will be internet enabled. The mobile phone has become the center of our personal life, and something we notice just by coincidence, but we see it true more and more, is people almost never lose their mobile phones. Your mobile phone can be stolen, you can drop it in the gutter, or as I did once, you can drop it in the bathtub. And if you ever do, incidentally, I learned turn it off and don't touch it for 2 days, rather than what I tried to do, which was dry it off and just fried. Anyway, but people almost never lose their mobile phones, and the reason they almost never lose their mobile phones is because if we leave it on a table in a restaurant, most of us can't get to the front door of the restaurant before we're reaching for it. We use it so much we can't get far enough away from it without noticing that it's gone. Whereas if I were in a restaurant and left my credit card on the table, it might take me 2 days to notice that I left my credit card, and I would have to retrace my steps. These have become the items that I said the teenagers are sleeping next to. that we are using and practically can't live without. And if you ask teenagers around the world, if you had to give up the internet, your mobile phone, or television, almost all of them would give up television first, the internet second, and their mobile phone third. Television dominates this generation less than any generation so far. That doesn't, since the beginning of television. That doesn't mean that television's not important to this generation. It is, but it's only one of several things that's important. This is a generation that wants to move its content freely from platform to platform, irrespective of anyone's desire to restrict them. The more we try to restrict them, the more they'll move their content just to show us they can move it. When the iPhone came out for the first time 3 years ago, it was only legally available in America on AT&T for a while. That didn't stop the rest of the world from getting copies of it. But it was in America, just after it came out, that there was a teenager in New Jersey on his way to college who became the first person to unlock the iPhone. And he was being interviewed by the news media. He showed his unlocked iPhone. The case was off. Wires were hanging out of it. And when he was being interviewed, he admitted he didn't even want an unlocked iPhone. He just wanted to stick it to Steve Jobs and show Jobs that you couldn't lock the iPhone on him. This is the quality of the generation we're talking about. They will challenge things even if they don't need to challenge it, just to show that you can't make them do what you want them to do. This is a generation that wants to be heard. Why there's so much user-generated content, blogs, Twitter, MySpace, Facebook. This is a generation, to paraphrase Andy Warhol, that couldn't care less about 15 minutes of fame. What they want is 15 megabytes of fame. Because 15 minutes of fame is gone in 15 minutes, never to be seen again. 15 megabytes of fame can and does last forever. And lastly, to those of us who are online, using email, and think we're hip and cool, to today's teenagers, email is something their parents do. They communicate through instant messaging, through Twitter, through social networks, and all kinds of other ways of communication. They think email is something old people do. Now, they're teenagers. They have time. Sadly, they don't discover how much time they actually had till they're older and no longer have it. But they can be synchronously in front of a screen at the same time as their friends. As they get older and pesky things get in their way, like jobs, spouses, and children, then all of a sudden the asynchronicity of email becomes very appealing. The fact that you look at it when you feel like it and you answer it even later. The very last thing, not on the chart, but I just want to say the one truly transformational thing we've seen with teenagers that they've gained through digital technology is empowerment. Power they've gained over journalists, that they'll read a story with an email address or a Twitter address of the author and immediately communicate with the journalist, telling him or her how they got it right, or more often than not, how they got it wrong, or adding information. The power we gain over physicians. Now today, when any of us have a sniffle or a cough or don't feel well, almost all of us go to the internet first before we go see a physician. And then we walk into the physician. We want to share all of our insights and research off of the web. Sadly, we want to do this with a doctor who more often than not wishes we would just shut up and take our medicine. But doctors are going to have to change as well. The power we gain over the sales process, the ability of the way we buy cars has completely changed. Even the funeral business, where consumers have information they never were able to get before and can even buy caskets online at steep discounts and other things, has completely changed. The power we've seen in America and Western Europe and in Japan and South Korea, the power over politicians to communicate, to demand information, we see that empowerment is the most important defining characteristic of digital attachment, and we think it's one of the most exciting developments.